This is the OMG Book Show with William O'Day, episode number 3.
Welcome to the OMG Book Show, where it's all about taking you into the brains of fantastic authors. No scalpels required. It's more than an interview, it's an experience. And now, your host, William O'Day.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 3. Thanks for joining me. Today, we have the distinct pleasure of chatting with Franklin Horton. He is the author of the acclaimed best-selling series, The Borrowed World. And in today's interview, we talk with Franklin about how self-reliance and being prepared relates to his life and how that also is reflected in his books, and even how some people have, in emergency situations, used information from his stories to help them in real-life situations, which is totally cool. And we also find out about how his best friend in real life makes his way into the books in the form of an enchantingly anachronistic character, which, from what Franklin tells us, is exactly how his best friend is in real life. So I fell in love with that character. I'm sure if you've read the stories, you will too. So we talk about all that and much more in today's interview. So let's get started. Today we're speaking with Franklin Horton, author of the Borrowed World series and also the Locker 9 series, and I'm super excited to have him on the show today. So Franklin, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks, Will. I appreciate the opportunity. It's always great to talk about books.
Man, I agree. Books, especially great books like yours. And I mentioned it just before we started recording, but your Borrowed World series, which I believe is at 5, is that right now?
Yeah, 5 and 2 in the spinoff series.
Okay, and that's Locker 9, I think. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So I started with The Borrowed World, which I believe is the first one in that series, and just got hooked immediately. It's a super wild, thrilling yet and I think this describes your books, like thrilling to read and yet at the same time terrifying to think could come true. Is that like what got you? How did you get started writing these types of books, or writing at all? Is this name that we see on Amazon, is that the beginning of your writing career? Or did you start somewhere back before that?
I'm one of those stories of persistence, and I've been at this almost for an embarrassingly long period of time. I was one of those teenagers who wanted to write from growing up reading Stephen King and all that. So I went to college as an English major, started writing immediately after I got out of college, and wrote for 30 years before The Borrowed World came along.
Holy moly, that's a long time.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. And, that was during the system when you had to get an agent and a publisher, and go that route. And what happened was, people who are kind of new to this don't realize this, but in the 1990s, the blockbuster era that hit Hollywood also hit publishing. So a lot of the opportunities for smaller authors were just gone because agents and publishers both wanted million sellers. Nobody wanted books that were going to sell 5, 10, or 20,000 copies. So I never was able to find a publisher or an agent. So I'd pretty much given up with 7 completed novels at the time.
Wow, and you had been shopping or like trying to get an agent or shopping those around in the meantime?
For 30 years, yeah.
Man,
it's ridiculous.
That is a story of unbelievable persistence.
Yeah, so, I'd given up, and then I decided when I started reading about KDP, the Kindle Direct Publishing Program, that I was going to try again. I was going to take completely new material, which was the type of books that I was interested in reading, the post-apocalyptic thriller, and I was going to start over with something in that genre and give it one more shot, and it worked well for me.
So when did you, I believe if I have the dates right, KDP kind of got rolling around 2009 or so. When did you become aware of it and start kind of thinking, hey, this might be a possibility?
I guess it was around 2012 that I started paying attention to it, which was when I started to hear about authors who were just coming out of nowhere and really nailing it with books. And, I think Amanda Hocking was one of the first people I read about that was making like $3 million a year fresh out of college, just writing urban fantasy type stuff. So I thought maybe there was an avenue there since I didn't have to deal with a publisher. And what I did at the time was I contacted a few authors that I really enjoyed who were independently published. And a lot of them were gracious enough to talk about the process and talk about, finding your own cover designer, your own editor, all that. So that's the route I went.
Yeah, I have to agree. I kind of got into it in a similar way. But it's one of the things that I love about this is the community of indie authors is so supportive across the board. And like you, I've shopped a book or two around in the traditional market, and that side of things just seemed like a kind of a Byzantine maze where every corner was unlit and you had to push through and try to make it completely by yourself. And it just seems that, I get a different sense from the indie community, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, traditional publishing is like dealing with the Vatican. They're
Right.
They're very entrenched, and they have their rituals, and you have to go by their rituals and their doctrine, and that's the only way it works for them.
I just realized that I never had the right kind of funny hat to make it work.
Yeah, it's all about the hat.
So what, maybe we don't have to get into it too deeply, but I am curious, those books that got shopped around for that 30-year period, were those also post-apocalyptic, or what were the genres you were pursuing there?
No, it's probably stuff that's never going to see the light of day because as an English major, the thing that they really push on you is literary fiction. Genre fiction is looked down on as being, subhuman. So my first 3 books I wrote were literary fiction, and then later I started working toward thrillers. But the thrillers probably just weren't developed enough and weren't good enough at the time to do anything with, and that's probably why they didn't get picked up. But, it helped me get where I am today because all those were learning experiences and, helped you learn the chops of how to structure a story and actually stick to it until a book is done.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree. It takes a goodly long while to figure out how to write a good story. So I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the Borrowed World book. One of the things that took me by surprise and frankly was terrifying was when you first have, kind of the news coming out of terrorists hit some critical infrastructure points. And then very quickly after that, they're just kind of like, one of the scenes I'm thinking about is they go into like a gas station just because they need gas and a few little supplies, and just how quickly things kind of turn chaotic and unstable. Do you think that is a reflection of how things would for sure pan out, or like what gave you that kind of idea to run it that way?
Well, what's interesting is there are a lot of people who respond that they don't think things would disintegrate that quickly because it truly is a matter in the books of what happens is there's a terror attack and resources become short. And when people can't get fuel, tempers flare and things become ugly really quickly. Well, after writing these books, I've heard from a lot of people in different walks of life. And one of the first letters that I got that was kind of a fan letter for this series of books was from a lady who was part of the Doctors Without Borders organization. And she talked about when they go to a disaster situation, that they are often there within 24 hours of the disaster occurring. And by that time, it is already sheer chaos. There are black markets set up. There's looting, theft rings, and that's the same thing we see when a hurricane occurs. People, a lot of times, who want to take advantage of these situations realize that they only have a short window to kind of take advantage of the system because the cops are distracted, providing rescues and emergency services.
Right.
So looting and violence tend to start really quickly. And that's from people who have been in this, that's the feedback they give me is the disintegration occurs within hours.
Wow. Yeah, that's very fast.
Yeah.
So I've been reading a little bit about you and your biography and kind of what things are important in your life. And it sounds like prepping and that idea of basically just being, that's what we call it these days, prepping, but it's really returning to something that was far more normal in years past or in decades past, generations past, where a lifestyle of trying to be resilient is required. It's just expected. Now, it seems like that kind of has, for many people in the modern age, has kind of slipped away. It sounds like that's a big part of your life. Would that be accurate to say?
Well, I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, which I'm sure is a shock to you from my accent, which you probably thought was New Jersey or something.
Yeah, I knew it was somewhere south of Canada and east of Oklahoma, but that was about it.
The Appalachian Mountains have always been about 20 years behind the times. So when I was growing up here in the late 60s, early 70s, it was a lot like the 1940s and 1950s. You still had a lot of people who were self-sufficient and lived off their farms. And so that was a big influence on me. And as I got older, I got into backpacking, and I really came into preparedness as a backpacker because a lot of what's in that first book, The Borrowed World, is kind of based on a trip that I used to have to take. So I just started taking my backpacking gear with me, figuring if things got really crazy, because this was in the post 9/11 era, right around the time Hurricane Katrina was taking place, and there was a lot of paranoia about travel at the time.
Yeah.
And, it occurred to me, well, if I get stuck somewhere, I'll just take my backpacking gear and I'll walk home.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially the idea, right? You have a backpack and you're on a trail and you don't have all the modern conveniences that we normally enjoy, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about the books not having this ninja special ops super soldier as the main character. And the feedback that I've gotten from people is that there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that read these type of books who are people exactly like that. They're people with an interest in this, but who don't devote their entire lives to, their shooting skills or, being able to, kill somebody single-handed with their bare hands.
Right, with their pinky or thumb or something.
Yeah, exactly. There are a lot of people who like to know about survival and preparedness, but then they get up each day and they live a normal life and they work and they do the things we all do.
Yeah, I think it's even just reading the books, of course, one can take education much further, but I think even just being aware in a fictional setting of this could happen, and then you kind of think about, well, if that happened, what would I do? And even just that exercise right there is helpful from a self-resilience point of view, Yeah,
because even though my books are about a terror attack that leads to this phenomena that they refer to as a cascading systems failure, my biggest concern has always been weather events because, we've had periods here where we've had some freak snowstorm of, 4 to 5 feet of snow and you get stuck home for weeks. And there have been neighbors of mine who have been without power for 6 to 8 weeks. So, there are a lot of weather events that are a much greater concern than some of the other things. So I think kind of the idea about preparedness is just to be prepared for anything that could occur, not necessarily the worst case scenario.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's interesting about it is in general terms, whatever way you kind of try to prepare yourself to become more self-sufficient or ready for an emergency like this, it almost doesn't matter what that emergency is, generally speaking, because those same things will help you for any of those possibilities.
Yeah, and that's why when I talk to people about these books a lot who are part of the preparedness community, a lot of what we talk about is what we call a preparedness mindset, which is just being flexible and adaptable and having a wide skill set that you can then apply to whatever crazy problem is in front of you.
Yeah, it's just being kind of open to problem solving. Like for example, my previous career was doing visual effects in movies for Hollywood, and while that was a whole lot of fun, I don't know that there's anything that would help me with in any kind of emergency. Even if the lights go out on my circuit breaker here at home, I'm like, oh, how do I? That doesn't help at all. Knowing what I knew.
You never know if you've got pyrotechnic skills or any electrical skills. That could always be something that there's a market for.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I wanted to ask you, it's you've written, at least that's visible to the public, a number of books, and it sounds like you said 7 or so before that. Do you have amongst your collection one that you personally feel like is like the standout that you really like more than the others? Personally,
I think the last 2 Borrowed World books, No Time for Mourning and Valley of Vengeance, were probably I think some of the better books that I wrote, because I've learned a lot, I think, since that first book. Because the first book, I never thought anybody was going to read it. So you don't feel any pressure or any responsibility to make it outstanding because you have no clue that anybody's going to read it.
Yeah, and then they all start paying attention, huh?
Yeah, and so you realize, well, I need to make sure I proofread more carefully. I need to make sure my cover's better, all that stuff. So that fourth and fifth book, I think I really spent a lot of time making sure that the characters were really in depth and that I kind of structured the conflicts to build tension and let off tension and just, kind of crank it up to where people were emotionally involved in the story.
Yeah, I think from what I've read, you succeeded for sure. So it sounds like you've really dialed up the amount of effort and energy that you put into a particular book. How long does it take you these days to go from start to finish?
I'm working hard on trying to get more books out faster because that first one, like I said, there was no pressure, so I took my time. Yeah, I think I'm overall down to about 6 to 8 weeks to write a book and then a little time to clean it up and work on promotion and all that stuff and covers. And I really want to get that down to where I can do about one a month. My goal is to be able to retire here in the next 2 years and focus on writing full time and then at least be able to get out, 5 to 8 books a year. That's what I'd like to do.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. So, but if you get it down to a month, you're looking at, I guess that's the range you're talking about, 8 to 12 books a year or so.
Yeah, that would be ideal. I don't know if a book a month is doable, but that's what I'd really like to be able to do because I've got a lot of ideas and I've got a lot of stuff on the back burner that I'm kind of doing notes on and charting out. So I think I've got the ideas and the material for those books. I just need the time to sit and crank them out.
Yeah, that's the writer's curse there. Too many ideas and never enough time. So looking at the collection of your books, clearly post-apocalyptic is your favorite genre, but are there other genres out there that you would like to pursue in the future?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because my books are really character-based rather than plot-based. So I like to start with characters and build a story around them. And I think that using that same technique, my books tend to be kind of dark and creepy anyway. So I'd like to take that dark and creepy and put it in thrillers and also maybe even a book in the supernatural genre because I just really like dark and creepy characters and I like stories that kind of get under people's skin.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, there's several genres that you could take that too.
Yeah, I agree. So you're clearly a writer now, and it sounds like you're trying to angle towards being the full-time version. What do you think is one of the best things about being a writer?
There are a lot of bad things about being a writer, and those are the things that always jump to mind because, it's kind of isolating. It's a thing you do by yourself. You're with a lot of or you impose a lot of pressure on yourself to make your work good and to sit down and make yourself crank out those words.
And it's like part of it is you don't know for sure how it translates until it's out there. So you put all that time into it and then you just have no idea until it's gone.
Well, yeah, and it was like I was saying earlier with those 7 novels that I completed and never could sell. Imagine your frustration when you've got that much work built up and, it's nothing but crickets. So you have this expectation that the world is going to come to your door and be banging it down wanting those books, and then it doesn't happen.
Hey, Franklin, we want those books. Come on.
Yeah, that's what I thought was going to happen, but it did not happen. No. But, it's shaping up better now because I think I have found what my readers like, but also a good idea of what readers in general expect. And I think that's a skill you can apply, across the board.
I agree completely. There are a lot of hard things about being a writer, but there are amazing things too. Being able to connect with fans and kind of even with, like fans bringing back to you comments or experiences that kind of like were never even a part of the original idea, and especially I think that could be true in this genre in particular, post-apocalyptic fiction, because we're writing a lot about these big emergency type situations, how people respond. And for some people that really connects on a deep level.
Well, it's the world building is one aspect of it. If you're talking about the more esoteric part of it, the idea of building a world that people then relate to and, find different aspects of that imaginary world that appeal to them is really rewarding. But as far as the concrete details, I hear from people a lot about the actual information they derived from the book that's been helpful to them in some way. During these hurricanes in Houston that led to the flooding, I was speaking on talk radio down there about water preservation and food storage. And this was all set up by somebody who read the books and thought, well, this guy knows a little bit about this. Let's get him on here talking to people because he can help them know how to better prepare for the next time.
Oh, wow. That is super cool.
The same thing happened during those California wildfires. I heard from a friend of mine who's like, we knew to do this and we knew to do that because we were prepared to lose power. And so even though it's fictional, there are little things in there that can actually help people in real life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love in reading your books, picking up those little details and strategies. And speaking of those wildfires, I live in Sonoma County, and we were just a few miles away from where the major damage and destruction occurred. And it is shocking just how fast things can turn from normal world to emergency situation, and it's time to respond. I mean, I recall going to sleep that Sunday night before they started, and everything seemed fine. I mean, there were huge winds blowing trees this way and that. But then just a few hours later, all of a sudden, people are literally running out of their homes in their pajamas, running for their lives, much less like trying to save their homes or other possessions. They're just trying to save themselves. It's just crazy how quickly it can all change.
In the preparedness community, they call that normalcy bias, which is the expectation that the world will always be the way it is right now, that things will always be normal and you will always be safe. And, there's nothing wrong with that attitude, but part of a preparedness mindset is to realize that that is just an illusion, that things can go crazy really, really quickly.
Yeah, and it's almost kind of miraculous that they don't go really crazy quickly more often, it feels like.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've written quite a few books in your career to this point. Is there one that you would say was harder than all of the others?
It was probably Locker 9, which was the spinoff of the Borrowed World series. Because what happened is when I wrote the Borrowed World series and I started going out to these preparedness events and meeting readers, a lot of people were saying, well, the thing that concerns me the most about a societal collapse situation is I've got a daughter in college, or I've got a son who lives 2 cities away with his family, and I worry about them, and how they would get back to us or if they would be safe. So this book, Locker 9, was about a really paranoid dad whose daughter was going away to college, and he was setting up a network and a supply system so that she could get home and she would have the materials to do that. I was writing from the perspective of a college-age girl, which was new to me.
Right.
So that, and that's part of what writers do, is put themselves anyway in a different situation, but trying to think that way and considering how much has changed since I was that age, that was a little challenging.
Did you, aside from deep meditations of what it means to be like a female 22-year-old or whatever, did you read forums or listen in coffee shops or any sort of research like that to get a feel for the tone there?
Fortunately, I work in my day job for a large employer. We have about 500 employees, and there are a lot of women that age. So I've, kind of observed them and taken notes. So it's like a field study, watch how they behave and how they speak and pick up enough information to at least hopefully make that realistic.
Right. I've done similar things, and I kind of always wonder, is someone thinking I'm a little bit creepy now because I'm essentially listening in on their conversations just to kind of get the cadence of how it happens? Yeah,
that's another one of those writer things, is you often get accused of being creepy.
It's true. Yeah. And speaking of, you were talking about kind of the paranoid dad thing. I never knew just how, I guess, paranoid or worried or anxious you could be, because I don't think I didn't really grow up with that sort of mindset. But then having two daughters, and it could be sons or daughters, but just kids, yeah, you certainly start to think about like, oh my goodness, and I need to keep these two being safe as well. And so how do I work that?
Well, and that's part of what spawned this book for me. When I wrote The Borrowed World, part of my job requirements were I had to make this trip for work twice a month that was about 700 miles round trip. And as I said, this was right after 9/11, and for 5 or 6 years I made this trip, and Hurricane Katrina occurred during this period when I was making this trip also. And I watched those people in the Superdome who were just down in New Orleans on business, and things went crazy. And that's when I started thinking, I've got kids at home that I need to get to, and I need to make sure they're safe. So kind of the plans that I put in place for myself and my children became this first book.
Became what Jim ended up doing to get back as well, you mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of scenes that I love about that book, and one that just popped into my head was when they jump up on the Appalachian Trail and they're cruising along, making progress, and then they run into some flavorful locals that end up causing them some serious trouble. Where did you make up those people, or are they people you have run into in real life?
Not to mischaracterize local people, but I've lived in this area my entire life. I've worked in the substance abuse and mental health field, where you often see people at their worst. So I see people like this on a daily basis.
Okay.
So, there it is no exaggeration. A lot of the people that are in my books that are either drug users or criminals or just general lowlifes or whatever you want to call them are based on either events that I've seen or people that I've experienced in my life. So it's accurate.
It's yeah, and I mean, you can go anywhere. The best and worst of humanity exists in every single place on Earth,
Yeah, it does.
And one of the other characters I loved, and I'm spacing on the name right now, but I just absolutely love the characterization as they make it. Jim and his group make it to some small town along the Appalachian Trail, and he runs into an old friend. And this guy is like, he's just a heavy drinker, and he's not super worried about dealing with whatever the end of the world might happening to. Is this someone that is also an amalgamation, or someone in real life? Who is that guy?
He is my best friend from growing up, and we're still close friends. And he plays what they call old time music, which is kind of the traditional music that was a precursor to bluegrass. A lot of people call it roots music now. But, he has played this for years, and he kind of lives in this 1920s, 30s, 40s mentality. He dresses in old-fashioned clothes. He plays old-fashioned acoustic instruments. He drives old cars. So he just doesn't get too wound up about the modern world. So he ended up becoming a character, and people love him.
Oh, yeah. He's fantastic. He just comes through so clearly,
Well, and that's part of knowing him, because I base a lot of my characters, they may not be an exact representation. Sometimes you take one person's physicality and put another person's mind or personality on it, but he is true to life.
Has he ever had the pleasure of reading about the characterized version of himself in these books?
He has, and we're friends on Facebook. So a lot of his friends have read my books too, and they all say, that's spot on.
That's awesome. Going forward, you had mentioned you are looking to transition to becoming a full-time writer. Obviously, that's a big goal, and I'm sure you're going to achieve that one. So looking beyond that, do you have any big goals that you'd like to achieve in your career?
Like probably every other writer in the world, I would love to have Netflix or Amazon series based on The Borrowed World. I would love to see that happen.
That would be cool, yeah.
Yeah, because, post-apocalyptic is one of those things that always transfers well. It's popular in the visual mediums. You've got The Walking Dead, but also, movies like Mad Max and other movies over the years that kind of deal with these themes. And I think they're always popular. They're always something that people get sucked into. So I'd love to see that happen.
That would be cool. And I think you had mentioned it earlier, but I think it would be great because your books seem to be so character focused. And so it wouldn't just, because sometimes post-apocalyptic stuff, when it gets transferred to film, and having worked in film myself, I saw this on films I worked with, where it just turns into like a huge kind of visual sort of extravaganza where everything's just blowing up like crazy and you don't really connect with the characters. And you know, if you do get to, if somebody picks up your work and transfers it like that, you know, and assuming they follow your direction, like the character relationships are just as important as like all this crazy stuff that's happening around them.
Well, you know, anybody can create a situation, you know, with blowing up stuff and looting and stealing food and this kind of drama. But the relationships are what draw readers and, in the case of movies, the people watching the movie into the story. You know, those relationships and those inner character conflicts, that's what engages people.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Well, we're getting near the end of the show, and as usual, that can mean only one thing. Welcome to the Rorschach round, where we use ambiguously odd questions to delve deeper into the minds of these amazing authors. Let's get started. So, Franklin, we're going to run through a series of questions that will give listeners and readers and fans out there a deeper, more intensive look inside your mind.
Well, that's scary.
Woo-hoo, let's proceed. All right, so here's one here. Have you ever killed someone in a book that made you mad in real life?
Absolutely.
All right, we probably shouldn't get any more specific than that, I'm guessing.
In the first book, yeah. The scene you were just talking about, how quickly things disintegrated in that convenience store.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This person gets killed in that book. If people want to know more about it, they can read that scene.
Okay. All right. Listen up. There it is, people. All right. Let's see. Okay. So if you could be any animal, what would you be, you know, just in imagination land? If you could be one, what would you be and why?
Probably a wolf, because they've got a little mystique about them. They live off by themselves most of the time and just kind of roam around the woods and act menacing. So that'd be cool.
That'd be cool. Yeah, and I mean they're majestic. So yeah,
I'd be that.
All right. Well, what's the worst job you've ever had?
Oh, I've had some bad ones. I worked in construction in Detroit for several years, and there was one time when we had a municipal sewer backup in a building. So my boss told me to show up at a certain building with a shovel, you know, first thing in the morning. So there was an entire warehouse that was filled about 2 or 3 feet deep with sewage that had backed up.
Wow.
Yeah, I quit that morning. I didn't pursue that.
Yeah, you're like, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah, so I quit. That was a lost cause.
Man, yeah, I've had some pretty bad jobs myself, including like roofing in Miami, in the Miami heat during the summer, where kind of like bent down on the roof, smacking nails all day long. But I think even as hard as that was, that 3 to 4 feet or whatever of effluent sounds way worse.
Oh, it was awful.
All right, so last one. I know I promised it was around 30 minutes. I think we're probably a little bit over, so I don't want to hold you too long here. So last one here. So let's take it into kind of the context of the genre that we happen to both write. And so if you were the last person in the world, what would you do? How would you spend your day? What would happen?
I think that I would sit outside and read a lot. I think I would use my time to collect books and make sure I had a nice library there. And I would probably sit outside on a little porch in a lawn chair and read.
That sounds like a good way to pass the time.
Yeah, what else could you do?
Yeah, well, I think that would be one great option. And before we end today, I wanted to find out, do you have any upcoming projects that we should be aware of?
Well, I just had a release yesterday, a new book, Grace Under Fire, which is the second book in that Locker 9 series. So that's my newest project, and I'm working on a supernatural project right now that I hope to have out in early winter, and probably going to continue the Borrowed World series. I'm not done with that, so probably over the winter, people should look for a new release in that series.
That sounds super exciting. We'll make sure and you have all this information in the show notes so people can go check it out there. And where can people go to find out more about you and what you do?
My website is the easiest place to start. It's franklinhorton.com. And then I'm real active on Facebook. I'm pretty easy to get up with. I interact with readers of the books on a daily sometimes hourly basis. So, people are welcome to reach out to me on there. I'm always glad to talk about the books or whatever people want to talk about.
Awesome. Well, I'll make sure and get that in the show notes as well. And Franklin, I just wanted to say it's been a real pleasure, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, I appreciate you having me on the show, Will. It was great. Thanks a lot.
So I hope you enjoyed the interview as much as I did, and thank you again to Franklin for joining us. If you would like to find out more about the links that he mentioned and the new book, Grace Under Fire, I have that in the show notes at www.williamodea.com/3. And in next week's episode, make sure and join us because we're going to be chatting with author and bioengineer Anthony J. Melchiori, and we're going to find out about how his career as a biogeneticist, I think I got that term right, has influenced and informed his fiction to make it incredibly creepy and almost too real. That's it for today. If you would like to be sure to never miss a show and always have them immediately available on your device of choice, you can subscribe by going to www.williamodea.com/iTunes. And if you enjoyed the show, I would so appreciate a rating and review on iTunes. They both help with store visibility, and they also let other listeners know if this show is something that they might be interested in checking out. And I've made it easy to access both of those by going to the same link on my website, www.williamodea.com/iTunes. That will have a link there that you can jump over to either subscribe and or maybe all three, rate and review the show. So I would so appreciate that. Thank you so much. That's it for now. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to the OMG Book Show. You can find out more at www.williamodea.com.